Ben Guttery. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon. It's great to be here in San Marcos. Good to be back here at this conference. I'm still shocked at what I see in San Marcos. I went to undergraduate school here back in the mid-'80s, and San Marcos has changed a little bit since I was here. It looks like it's doubled in size. We wanted to just talk a little bit about the Airport Improvement Program and where we are and where we're headed. There's a lot of stuff up in the air right now. I want to talk AIP stuff first, and then talk. Greg's going to take it over and kind of describe how it applies in the state of Texas. So currently, this is what just kind of a handful of things that we wanted to talk about. I don't have a real lengthy presentation, but one of the things that we discovered recently when we were talking about airport funding is, a lot of you have been doing this a while, and I've been doing this a while, but we've got lots of people that don't really remember some of the things that make the Airport Improvement Program work, and the rules and some of the basics that we probably learned and then forgot and abused years ago. It's a matter of just refreshing ourselves on what the AIP is all about, what its purpose is. And that's one of the things I wanted to do. And then we'll talk a little bit about formulas. I think Greg's going to talk a little bit about some of the formulas that we have and how we distribute the monies out. And there's a lot up in the air with the AIP program, as Dave talked a little bit about this morning. Legislation, all still up in the air right now. We'll get into that. It's a lot to talk about. We've got a lot of issues about some of our legislative challenges that we have, and I think you're aware that our program is kind of broken into having an authorization that is a little bit different from some of the other programs. It comes with the ability to fund right away. We actually get the program approved and get the finances approved in two separate congressional actions. Ideally, those would match up. They haven't been matching up lately, and that's why we've had continuing resolutions. Well, that's kind of something you see government-wide. So a temporary extension, we're currently operating under a temporary extension that expires April 29th. What is today? Yeah, that's coming up pretty quick. And the government's busy doing a lot of stuff right now, and what our expectation is that we probably will have another continuing resolution. That continuing resolution may indeed just be a short one. It may just be for a very short span of time. We'll see in a second how that affects what we're able to do, what we're able to give Greg as far as monies to spend on projects, because it does complicate things enormously when we don't have enough money to actually run the program. And that's really just one of our challenges right now. I don't want to be all doom and gloom. We've been through this before. I'm sure we'll do this again. But the good news is we've done this dance so many times that we always make it work. And that's the important part to remember. And that's, we've got some new people at the FAA in Fort Worth as well in our office. So some of the new people are, worried about the government shutting down on the 29th. And one of my first bosses at the FAA said, they talk about it all the time. It'll never happen. Well, it's happened like 2 or 3 times since I've been there, but that was after he retired. So he never got to see that and see how weird that can make things. You'll understand that Airport Improvement Program is the way the federal government sponsors and improves our national transportation infrastructure, and specifically in relation to airports. Well, what happens is monies get collected, and we'll have some visuals on that here in a second. And it was recognized early on, like in the early days before World War II, when airports were operated really as private entities in more cases than not. Burbank and other big commercial airports, those were private ventures. Well, as the realization came that airports needed to be public entities that tended to be sponsored by local communities. The local communities realized, just like they realized with the railroads, that they needed to have a place for airplanes to come to. And that's how we got federal investment in airport infrastructure. And it goes back really the modern programs. There was some development and federal investment prior to World War II. Most of it came about at the end of World War II today. You'll see that there were a couple federal programs in 1946, and some of those programs we still keep records on because some of those programs are what kept or are still some of the obligations that we live under. If you bought land, for example, back then, or received surplus property airports, a lot of those requirements and restrictions you still live under to this day. Good or bad, that's what we've got. You can see our most recent legislation was in '82. That's when the airport improvement program was started. Since then, we've really just been adding on to that basic framework that came around in 1982. Okay, so where does that money come from? It gets collected on ticket taxes. It gets collected on cargo way bills, I believe tires, aircraft tires, all sorts of fuel charges and taxes. There are a number of income sources that contribute to the Airport and Airway Trust Fund, which generates $15 to $17 billion each year. This is just an example of the ticket tax, and that ticket tax rolls into the Treasury, and all those other revenue sources rolls into the Treasury. You know, we know, because we hear from folks like y'all, that you have things that you want to do at your airport to preserve it, make it better, do expansions, do the stuff that you need to do to keep a safe and efficient airport. And then that eventually gets turned into projects. Pretty simple. So the kinds of things that we can pay for, and I'm sure y'all are all well aware of the kinds of things we can pay for, and it pretty much mirrors the kinds of things that TxDOT Aviation can pay for. And we're going to talk about this table some more later, but the kinds of things that we pay for, think about where the airplanes can go and where the people can go. Those are the kind of things that we can pay for. I guess one of our challenges is we've got a lot of infrastructure out there at airports that may have been developed during World War II, and that those airports are getting old. We've got drainage, we've got pavements, we've got all sorts of infrastructure that needs improvements, and they're all enormously costly. And you know, we've been kind of tasked with reminding folks that these are your community airports. We'd love to be able to give as much funding as we can to help you keep them efficient and safe, but you're the one out there on the front leading the charge with your city fathers or mothers, and leading the efforts with counties and the community to keep that airport in the good condition that it's in. We're there to help. It's not our airport. I think we're going to talk a little bit about what the national airport system looks like in just a second, but the idea is that, you know, you're the first ones there each day, typically. You may be the one mowing the grass and doing everything from beginning to end. And, you know, we look to y'all to be really on the forefront of the airport world, and we're just there to help. And as the guy from the San Antonio FSDO joked earlier that he was from the FAA, here to help, yeah, we are here to help. Some of that help doesn't doesn't come easily, and y'all all know it's a challenging thing to get some of these projects accomplished. But look around, look at the airports that we've got. We've got some tremendously strong and vibrant airports doing things that you couldn't even imagine decades ago. So, job well done as far as that goes. So let's talk about what airports we can spend money at. We have a national plan of airports called the National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems, or the NIPIAS is its abbreviated. There are quite a few airports in Texas, as you can see. All those little blue dots and the red airplanes are some of the commercial airports. We have a number of relievers, and we have a number of privately owned airports as well that are able to receive Airport Improvement Program funding. Quantity of airports, you can see we have got just a handful, and this number just changes occasionally. Over on the right side of the screen, the number of proposed airports. It's probably the smallest number of proposed airports I ever remember seeing, and it may be because it's so challenging to actually get that done that it takes an enormous commitment to make that occur. If you look at the existing airports, we've got a pretty healthy list of different categories of airports that are out there doing and providing services on all different kinds of levels. But I think you're probably familiar with these numbers. So how much funding is available? And Greg's going to talk about this some more later. But you can see the amount of funding that we have has had some ups and downs. And when I started in this business, we had about $500 million a year in Airport Improvement Program funding. About a decade or a little more ago, our funding got a big boost and a big increase. And we started seeing levels of funding in the little over $3 billion range nationwide annually. And that amount of funding has stayed pretty constant. You can see that kind of mostly horizontal line from the middle of the chart over to the right side of the chart. Although that's a lot of money, that doesn't mean everything else has stayed constant. We've seen construction costs continue to increase every year, and I'm not sure that I could agree or even advocate the fact that the funding has stayed up with that. I think it's pretty easy to argue that funding has not stayed up with that. We've seen some changes in the way some of our funding is handled really with the advent of the passenger facility charge. I think we looked at that, and the industry saw that as a way to kind of bring some money back into the system. And PFCs do wonderful things for bigger airports. For general aviation, they do small things, and a lot of the things it's really difficult to see the improvements. I think I heard Dave talk this morning about some proposals to increase the levels of funding, increase the levels of PFCs at some of the bigger airports. And frankly, I looked after the PFC program for a few years, and one of the first questions I got from a big airport in Texas was, when can we make this $25 instead of $4.50? I thought, wow, the amount of revenue. But their projects that they have to do that kind of work, they build a building over here, it's $1 billion. They build a people mover, it's $1.5 billion. Just enormously expensive projects, and the $4.50 a passenger chips away at that, but it probably is not kept up where it needs to keep up. Well, the whole reason I'm talking about the PFC program, one of the agenda items that's being talked about for the future of AIP is if the passenger facility charge increases, those bigger airports would not get an AIP any longer, and potentially the smaller airports would have funds to do all the myriad of things that we need to do. So there is some hope out there, and I think that's one of the many legislative items, and I'm sure you'll all hear from your industry folks that there's just a ton of things out there being talked about for changes to the airport improvement program. You can see our legislation goes back to 1982. There have been changes in the industry, quite frankly, and the changes that have occurred have been both up and down. We talked about the non-primary entitlement. We'd love to see some tweaks to that to make it a little bit easier, a little bit friendlier to use. I think there were some unintended consequences of that program that we're dealing with, and just a few kudos to the state of Texas. They worked through some very difficult times. Dave talked a little bit about the discretionary funding and how the FAA stopped that for a brief period of time. That was a very difficult time for both FAA and TxDOT because those funds are used well and needed. That was a difficult time for both agencies. However, in retrospect, there was probably not anything better that could have been done. Across the country, TxDOT Aviation is being recognized for what it took to say, let's get this thing fixed and get the dollars and the processes all fixed. So, we have states from around the country looking to TxDOT to see how they administer this program. And I can't thank y'all enough for the work on that, and I apologize for the tough time that there was, but we're back in the business of giving those discretionary funds again, and plan to keep on doing that. So, sorry to get on a little sideshow there. Some of the AIP funding breakdown, we have really two major categories of funding, and it's apportioned funds or entitlement funds, and that represents a great majority of the program. There are also discretionary funds. Those are not quite as many as you might think, because there are other demands on some of that same funding category. And we see things like noise programs, other programs that have a certain dedication that we've got to fund those, whether we, let's just say there's some challenges in getting all those funded. We usually have no shortage of projects, ever. That's never been a challenge. What we do have is a shortage of really good competitive projects, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk about is to make sure that we've got those kinds of projects that really help the system and compete well for funding. And my boss has made it clear that what we're here to do is to get money to spend on infrastructure in Texas, and so that's what we're here to do, and that's usually not a problem to accomplish. Let me get one more. Okay, there we go. There shows the rest of that funding. So we have those entitlement or apportioned funds. Those are given out to airports or states based on their size or the activity. And then those other funding areas like noise, we have some security, some safety, some other things. And it's kind of unfortunate that we have a category called safety, because it's really all safety, and that's what we do. There's some hybrid funding, and those are in some of the nasty details, but they are some of the nasty details that come back and do some funding for general aviation. So we'll look a little bit more closely at that. I already mentioned a little bit about the passenger entitlements and how those funds are distributed. Those are given out based on the activity of each of those airports, based on the number of passengers they enplane. So airports that have a lot of passengers get funding based on those dollar amounts. based on the number of passengers. We have cargo entitlements as well that are given out for airports, and there are just a handful of them in Texas, and they're just a pretty small number across the country. And you can see from that number that you really got to land a lot of cargo to be able to accept those kind of funds. The state funding is what is given to each state in the country based on area and I believe it's area and population, is that right? But you can see that we have several different ways in which the funding is allocated. And as that funding gets allocated, we're the ones there getting it distributed and making sure all the requirements for all the different programs are met. All right. The apportioned funds and the discretionary hybrid. Really the key part of this is to remember that we talked about the small airport fund. We are beneficiaries, GA is beneficiaries of that as it comes back into the system. These are funds that when a large airport has a passenger facility charge, that passenger facility charge requires that a portion of their entitlement funds are sent back to the larger fund. So they don't get 100% of their entitlement funds. They get a portion of those. That difference is given to the small airport fund. And that's one of the ways that smaller airport projects get funded. That is mostly it's not real apparent. It's one of those things that occurs and the funding happens and it's not terribly apparent in the program we always have challenges in saying, well, how did that work? How did that actually occur? Well, at the end of this, when we go through the calculations, there are pieces of those calculations and kind of set-asides and amounts identified for each of the line items and projects and effort areas, if you will. And Greg will be able to talk some to that as well. So our AIP discretionary funding, everybody loves discretionary funding. Unfortunately, we never have enough discretionary funding. That's what we identify each year and assign to individial projects at individual airports. It's not quite as discretionary as you might think because we're actually now planning out so far ahead that last week we were looking at funding for our 2020 program. And the way that works is we've identified projects for 2017. Those are already in the works and we're waiting on funds to make those projects occur. 2018, 19, and 20, we've established a capital improvement program based on airports that give us capital improvement programs, airports that work with TxDOT to put their capital improvement programs together. And then TxDOT gives us what I would call the highest and best projects that are most able to meet all the criteria for discretionary funding. That is about the worst place in the world to be, saying, I'm sorry you didn't get any. But Greg only passes those off to us on occasion, thank you. But it's part of the job. All the projects are important. Some of our challenges with discretionary funding, just like with all the other funding, it's got to be eligible and justified and be something that can compete with the other airports out there. And the types of projects that compete well are projects on a runway and projects on a taxiway. When apron projects get talked about, we get a little bit squeamish on those, and it's because the aprons may not be contributing to all the goals that we have for discretionary funding, and a lot of the pressures that we have in funding improvements at airports that really make a lot of sense for the flying community. It may make may make downtown feel great that they got funding for that, but we can talk and cuss and discuss and argue for days discretionary funding, but it's an enormous challenge for us to make sure that we get all the important projects covered, and I think that's our goal. I don't know, we could probably argue that we've never met that goal, and I can just say that we certainly try to get to all those projects, that there are lots of challenges out there to make that happen. My time is about done. I really just wanted to talk about the history of the AIP, where we were currently with the program. We're kind of almost a limbo area between having what our plans made. We have plans made through April 29th. We have plans for the rest of the year. We have received some of the funding that we can spend for this year. We've received about 60% of the funds that would be available for this year. We've programmed some of those funds and sent them into their processes for all the approvals and so forth. Some of the challenges, the new administration does not quite yet have a method figured out on how they will announce those projects. We have a process where your congressman will call you and say, okay, Greg, we got you all this money, or Longview or Tyler, for those airports that we deal directly with. The same goes for the state. Is there political and congressional notifications that are made? That piece is still new for the new administration, and they're figuring that out. I'm sure it'll get worked out. It's one of those items that as soon as they have to figure it out, it'll get figured out. That's how it works every change of administration. Okay, we've got, I'll make sure I covered everything. Greg's got some formulas that he's going to show, and I think we are going to take a quiz at the end of this to make sure that...
should be under your chairs.
Yeah, you will be quizzed on this either before you leave or before you can check out. So keep a close eye on that. Again, I very much appreciate being here. I'll be here today and tomorrow. I'll be at the listening session if you have some exceptionally hard questions, which I'm sure most of you will. But I'll be here the next couple days. Anthony McHale, also from my office, is here. Just as I was standing up here, my boss called and said, emergency, so Anthony may still be out taking care of that. But we'll be here the next couple days, and glad to be here, and certainly we'll try to answer any of your questions when we get I don't think we're doing questioning here, but I'll be here, and we'll be at the listening session tomorrow. So I'm going to pass it back to Greg and let him get into a few more details.